Over the last few weeks, one of the largest real estate owners in the world, Evergrande, has started to collapse financially. The company is now so far in debt that it might actually default on a lot of its loans. In fact, Evergrande currently has over $300 billion in debt. And because Evergrande is such a big business in China, experts are worried that its fallout could affect other economies around the world. That means an Evergrande collapse could mean major changes to American markets. The situation with Evergrande has even led some investors to compare it to what happened with the Lehman Brothers and the housing crisis back during the Great Recession of 2008. So what exactly is Evergrande? How did they get in this mess in the first place, and why does all this even matter? Well, we'll be covering all of that and what actually might be coming next in the Evergrande saga in today's business and financial breakdown, so make sure to stick around till the very end to figure out everything that's going on with Evergrande. And before we move on, as always, make sure to smash that thumbs up button below if you liked this video and ring that notification bell too, so that way we can continue to make more videos just like this one. Thanks for doing that. As I said before, Evergrande is one of the largest owners of real estate in the world. And it's definitely one of the largest in China, as it's involved in almost 5,000 real estate properties and projects across the country. In addition, the company owns real estate in almost 600 cities, and the company has around 200,000 employees. The company is even public in the Hong Kong market, and its bonds appear across multiple different markets around Asia. And Evergrande is one of the biggest reasons why China's economy has boomed in recent years. This is simply because it's been able to rapidly buy real estate assets, as well as keep around 250,000 of China's population employed. But it looks like Evergrande has bit off a little bit more than it can chew. That's because as its assets have grown, meaning it's bought more property, it has not been able to bring in more revenue or net income. So while Evergrande was buying a lot of things, and it owns a lot, it wasn't actually doing it with its own money. The company has been borrowing money and using investor money to buy properties. Revenue is just the total amount of money that those properties generated. So this would be like individual sales on the property or rent from tenants. Net income is whatever's left over after you take the amount of revenue and subtract the cost of owning that property. Costs would include repairs on the property, any taxes that you have for the property, and anything that you have left that you borrowed from a loan. All of that needs to be paid on a monthly or annual basis. And by the end of 2020, the company had around $500 billion in total revenue, but it only ended up keeping around $8 billion of that for its net income. It's managed to cut that number down a little bit and now has around $300 billion in total equity. Equity is just the difference between how much you actually own of a property versus how much you actually finance. So for instance, if you bought a car for $25,000 and you currently owe around $10,000 in the vehicle, your equity in that car would be $15,000. Simply put, this would be $25,000 versus the $10,000 that you still owe, meaning that you have around $15,000 already paid towards that vehicle. And right now, Evergrande's debt is in the hundreds of billions of dollars. So basically, the company has way too many assets and can't pay for them. And since it's not able to bring in enough revenue, it can't cover all of its debt either. And right now, Evergrande is on the verge of defaulting on all of its loans. So, what exactly will happen if Evergrande defaults? Well, this may cause a major crash in the Chinese economy, similar to what we saw with the Lehman Brothers Corporation in 2008. I've talked about this a ton in other videos, but Lehman Brothers was one of the largest financial services companies in the world. They also just happened to be the 4th largest investment bank in the United States. But beginning in the early 2000s, the company began buying mortgage-backed securities, and that ended up leading to its collapse in 2008. At the beginning, these securities were seen as super safe investments because they were tied to mortgages, and as long as people were making their payments, cash flow would continue to investors. But they were also tied to a ton of adjustable rate mortgages. Rates on these mortgages were typically very low, and it allowed a lot of people who could not afford to buy a house in the first place to now purchase a home for the first time. But the adjustable portion of the adjustable rate mortgage began to reset, as it does after a certain period of time. And once the adjustable rate mortgages reset, they were set to a much higher interest rate than they were before. This meant that a large portion of the United States could not afford their mortgages anymore. And that safe investment of mortgage-backed securities was not looking very safe anymore. Lehman Brothers owned a large portion of these mortgage-backed securities and assets, so when people stopped paying their mortgages, Lehman Brothers stopped getting paid too. This, among many other things, led to a major stock market crash, and not to mention the Great Recession of 2008. And now a very similar situation is happening in China. See, Evergrande owns a ton of real estate throughout the country, and that means there are thousands, if not millions, of investors also tied to those properties. Not to mention the actual bank banks that supplied the loan and all of the resources that Evergrande uses. So if Evergrande defaults, it will send huge ripples throughout the Chinese economy. Initially, banks will be the first one to get hit because they will no longer be receiving any payments from Evergrande. This could result in a massive loss of revenue. In addition, all of the thousands or millions of people that live on Evergrande's properties will be directly affected. If Evergrande defaults and nobody's actually able to come in to buy those properties, then all of those people are going to have to find a new place to live. In addition, all of the suppliers and resources that Evergrande uses will no longer be being used. This means third-party companies and services who depend on Evergrande's properties for revenue will no longer be receiving it. And they'll probably go under too. So what exactly could be coming next for Evergrande? Well, because it looks like this will have some major consequences on the Chinese economy, the Chinese government may actually step in to alleviate some of Evergrande's financial troubles. Experts believe that the financial assistance could be something similar to a bailout, which we saw in the United States back in 2008. Essentially, the Chinese government may give Evergrande enough money to actually support itself through some of its financial obligations. This money will most likely be reserved to help its citizens. That means it is highly unlikely that most of the money that Evergrande is giving will need to be used towards housing. This will help it pay off all of its residential-style assets and leave most of its commercial assets untouched. So if that were to happen, Evergrande will be left with two choices. Either figure out a way to pay for all of its assets, or liquidate them, which basically just means selling them off for cash. Because if they default on those loans, that could cause other markets around the world to drop as well. Any investor that actually owns shares of Evergrande or any investor that has equity in those properties would also lose their money. And currently, a large portion of American and European companies own a ton of Evergrande corporate bonds. These companies include Ashmore Group, HSBC, and BlackRock. And because many European governments and the US government printed so much money last year helping companies and people, they do not want to have to print more money if Evergrande fails. And right now the world is kind of at a standstill with the Chinese real estate market because of Evergrande. Offshore investors and even some domestic investors are kind of waiting things out to see what happens. They don't want to make an investment if the economy is going to tank soon. This move by itself is already causing a slight slowdown in the Chinese economy. But how far it really slows down will ultimately depend on what happens with Evergrande. And what comes next is really anyone's guess. But one thing is for sure, we are all holding our breath for Evergrande. So, what do you think will happen with Evergrande? Do you think that it's ultimately going to default on all of its loans, or do you think the Chinese government will help to kind of bail it out? In addition, do you think a Lehman Brothers style collapse is what's in store for Evergrande and the greater Chinese economy? Whatever your thoughts are, let me know in the comments below before you go. As always, thank you so much for watching, and if you like this video, make sure to hit that subscribe button as it helps out this channel so much. But that is it for today's Business and Financial Breakdown. Keep hustling, money minds, and I'll see you all in the next one.